Hello, welcome to Keg That's YouTube channel. Today I want to talk to you about this yeast, Mangrove Jack's M41 Belgian ale yeast. And what Mangrove Jack says about it is, spicy and phenolic, this yeast emulates the intensity and complexity of some of the best monastic breweries in Belgium. High attenuation and alcohol tolerance make it suitable for a large range of Belgian beers. So I agree with some of it and maybe disagree with other bits, and like most yeast manufacturers, they don't give a great deal of detail, so I've tried it out to go into more detail and I'm going to share that with you today. It would also be good to talk about dry yeast versus liquid yeast, as it's quite relevant for a Belgian strain. So it's got fairly high attenuation. I mean, it goes up to 88%, which is quite a lot. The flocculation is medium, and yep, that's sort of what I've experienced. The alcohol tolerance is 12%, and I've not brewed a 12% beer. Often with yeast, you can kind of push them a bit more, but you might start to get some off flavours and other issues. I brewed this, it's a Belgian IPA with it. And I've got a video on how I brewed that and more of an in-depth tasting there. I'll link below, so after this video you can go and watch and it might make a bit more sense. But in short, I did an open fermentation with this, and that will really help get more flavours from this kind of yeast. What I have found is that this yeast was a bit of a beast when it was fermenting. High Krausen was achieved within, I think, a day or so, if I remember correctly, and then it died down. And it was mostly fermented within like 4 or 5 days. And I just left it a bit longer, just to condition a bit. And I think this yeast does benefit with time, which is an interesting choice then for an IPA. However, when it was fresh in the keg, it was really, really good. It had those nice hoppy flavours, as well as some really punchy yeast flavours. But the aroma was, I guess, classically Belgian, so banana, clove, pepper, that sort of thing. And as the beer has been aging, I have found the intensity of those aromas has been different. So sometimes I poured myself off some and it's been huge banana, other times it's been a huge amount of clove, which I find quite interesting, and it's been quite a complex aroma. And again, on the flavour, I found something really similar, very similar flavours. And over time, as the hop character has died down a bit, the yeast character has remained very strong and has kept flavour in this beer. So I have it on keg as opposed to bottle. What's quite interesting as well is that I find this yeast has been fairly resilient. So I had a bit of trouble with my Kieser recently, meaning that I've had to turn the temperature off and on. So this beer has been going through quite a bit of temperature fluctuations. It's also lost pressure, and I've had to depressurise it and pressurise it quite a bit. And the yeast has still held strong. It's still a really good beer. One flavour that has been coming through, which perhaps I'm not such a fan of, is an alcoholic flavour, so like fusel alcohol, that kind of thing, which I think maybe all these like temperature and pressure changes have started to stress this yeast out, or perhaps just imparted these off flavours to the beer. Which does make me think, I fermented this in a temperature controlled environment, and I think that it has really benefited this yeast. I would strongly recommend that this yeast gets temperature control of some kind, whether it's in a fermentation chamber or placing the fermenter in a bucket filled with water, because I do feel that if this goes a bit wrong, it can throw out some flavours of alcohol, which of course isn't actually that great in most Belgian style beers. And I think this is the other thing, saying Belgian style beers. So there are specific flavours you get throughout almost all Belgian beers, but there are a lot of Belgian styles and they differ quite significantly for each other. I wouldn't use this in a Belgian stout, for example. I also wouldn't use this in a dark Belgian beer like a Brune or something like that. And the reason being is because the flavours are very punchy and they go really well in something like, if you think of like a Westmalle Blonde, Le Chouffe or something like that, it's gonna do really well. Like those sort of spicy phenolic flavours will do really well in those kinds of styles. However, when it comes to styles like stouts and ambers and brunes and that kind of thing, you want the yeast to take a bit of a step back and you want more of the malts to come forward. And I think that this yeast would be a bit too dominant in something like, let's say, a Rochefort 12 clone or something like that. I think somewhere where it would be really good though is in a mixed fermentation beer. It's got so much character that it can bring forward, and that something which would be really good to try, which I might do one day, is to brew a sort of strong Belgian blonde beer and then add some Brettanomyces and maybe some souring bacteria as well. And I think that this would add a lot of really interesting character to that kind of beer. And I would use this in a Belgian IPA again. It really let the hops shine through and created a really, really good balance of hops, malt and yeast. Something which I will do is I've sort of changed my brewing setup recently so I can do comparisons. I can make a wort and then split that wort and compare it to different things. And I think I might do a shootout between this yeast and a different Belgian yeast to see how it compares. So if that's of interest to you, please do subscribe, because those videos will hopefully be being made in the not too distant future. Compared to other Belgian yeasts, I've made quite a lot of Belgian beers in the time that I've been homebrewing. However, it has been a while since I made my last one. I've used liquid yeast, I've used dried yeasts, and this one I definitely would keep in rotation. Definitely use this for a blonde, I'd definitely use this for an IPA again, and as I said, I might try a mixed ferm with this as well. However, when it comes to dry versus liquid yeasts, it's quite interesting because liquid yeast are still seen as superior. And even though dried yeasts have come on leaps and bounds in the past like 10 years or so, when it comes to clean yeasts, like something like US-05 or lager yeasts, it's probably better to go with dry yeast because they're easy to handle and they taste just as good as their liquid equivalents. I've read online that with liquid yeasts, it's better to go for the liquid version when the style of beer you're making takes its flavour from the yeast. So if you're making a yeast forward beer like a Belgian ale, a saison, something like that, it's best to use the liquid version as that is the better quality yeast. That might be the case. I think that's something which would be really interesting to do, would be to compare dry yeast versus a liquid comparison, and maybe I will do that in my trials. But considering that liquid yeast needs a lot more care, you need to make a starter for it, and dried yeast is just a lot easier to handle, I'm really happy just using this. It tastes great, and I think that if I got this beer at a bar and it was a Belgian IPA or a hoppy Belgian blonde or something like that, I'd be very, very happy with this. There is a bit more choice with liquid yeast, so I understand why people still go for it, but there's more and more dry yeast coming out all the time, and it's really interesting to see what the yeast labs are coming out with. Anyway, if you've used this yeast before, I'd really like to know how it's gone for you, so do comment below on your thoughts on this yeast. If you want to see more videos on homebrewing and you want to see some of these split tests that I do, then do subscribe. And please also give this video a like if you found it useful. Thanks so much for watching.